Recently, the mocking framework Mock made the development news by trying to change how it requested sponsorships. This caused a lot of uproar in the community with anger over how the changes were made, what the changes did, and the idea that open source software would kind of force this asking for money idea. With all that going on, let's break down what happened specifically with Mock, including what the changes were and if we should use it in our projects going forward. And then we'll look at open source software in general to understand the growing trend among packages to change how the monetization for the packages work. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's jump right in with what is Mock. Well, this is right from the GitHub page for Mock. Mock is the most popular and friendly mocking library for .NET. You can see some examples here. Essentially, what it allows you to do is replace your dependencies so in your unit testing, you test just the unit of work that you're trying to work on rather than the unit and all the things it depends on. So that's what Mock is. I actually have a video on this channel talking about how to use Mock in unit testing because it is a really easy to use and popular .NET library for mocking. So what did Mock do, or what did the maintainer of Mock do that was kind of, irritated the community? So let's talk first. The first date we want to look at is January 24th. This is when SponsorLink, we'll talk more about what SponsorLink is, but essentially it's a way to ask for money from people. SponsorLink blog post was published on January 24th. This is where the maintainer of Mock said, hey, I'm working on something. And by the way, note that the maintainer of Mock doesn't just work on Mock. He works on a lot of other projects as well. And on his blog, he said, hey, this is what I'm looking at for things like sponsoring the next version of Mock. So that was published on January 24th. Now, there were 0 comments on it until a couple of days ago. So there was not really any interactions with this, but it's also a personal blog. Now, August 7th, SponsorLink was added to Mock. It was part of the release notes that, hey, we're adding SponsorLink to Mock. Now, that caused some chaos, and there were some things that came up where it caused some problems for builds on Mac and Linux, and it also raised some GDPR concerns. So on August 9th, SponsorLink was removed. Now, what that means is for version 4.19, you can still use it with no SponsorLink. And for version 4.20.2, you can use Mock without SponsorLink. It's just in between, and those are kind of pulled from, I think, NuGet packages as well. So it's no longer something that Mock does, but it will be something that happens in the future. Another one of the complaints that happened, that was brought up, was the fact that SponsorLink was a DLL. It was not open source itself, and so therefore there was concerns about, hey, what else could be going on in this, or in the future, what could be added to this that might not be okay. We can't see that as part of your source code. So as a result, August 10th, SponsorLink was also open sourced. So this is the kind of timeline of what's happened with Mock. So August 9th, this is when everything went haywire, where Mock added SponsorLink to their project and said, hey, we're going to do this for sponsorships for Mock. That caused a lot of problems. It was backed out on August 9th. Now, that does not mean it will never come back. In fact, the goal is to bring it back. So, but the concerns that were raised are going to be addressed. For example, it not being open source. Well, it's already taken care of. The way it captured email addresses, there was some concern over GDPR issues. That's being addressed. And it not building right on Mac or Linux, that has been addressed, I believe. So that's what Mock did. Now let's talk about what SponsorLink is and why it's so concerning to the community. Well, SponsorLink is that when you're using your IDE, so Visual Studio, VS Code, or Writer, when you're actually using your IDE, SponsorLink will get your email address from Git. Now, if you're not familiar, in Git, when you set up Git, you say, here is my name and here's my email address. And that gets attached to every commit you make. So when you make a commit, part of that is your name and email address. And that's associated with every commit you make. And every time you push to GitHub, you're sending that information along. So what SponsorLink decided to do was they're going to pull that email address from Git, hash it, and use it to check to see if you're sponsoring the mock project. And it will put a build warning if you're not. So in your editor, it's going to put a build warning. Now, this does not run on your CI/CD server. This does not run on automated builds. This does not run from the command line. It only runs if you're inside of, again, Visual Studio, VS Code, Writer, another IDE. So that was the goal. And the goal was, okay, the developer of Mock said, I need sponsorships in order to keep going. And so he said, I'm going to get sponsorships from developers. And again, it's $1 or $2 a month from every developer that uses Mock rather than trying to figure out a corporate system. So to be clear, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but just going corporate and doing licensing is actually a lot harder and a lot more involved and can be a lot more expensive. So he decided not to go that route, but decided just to put a nag screen in your build section to say, hey, you haven't yet sponsored the thing you're using. So this is what happened, but going back to that, it hashes your email address. That's not necessarily, it's not encrypting your email address. That's just hashing, which is reversible, which means it's still publicly identifiable information, which does fall under the GDPR. Now, the one confusion that came in here is people kept saying your users, the user email address, the user email address. The user in this context is the developer, not the end user of the software. It's a little bit of a difference there, but that was the idea behind SponsorLink. So with that kind of brief overview, let's talk about my thoughts here. First one, SponsorLink needs a lot more work. So yes, it was not a fully baked solution, and just putting it in a kind of production version of Mock probably wasn't the best idea. It probably should have been in a kind of a beta release or an alpha release, or something like that, where people could test it out and see if it's right for them or not, or kind of work the bugs out and so on. So it needs more work, but I'm not going to say it needs to be removed entirely. Now, yes, for now, for sure, you can't put it in a production version if it isn't production ready. But I am loath to say that the maintainer of the project can't do what they want to do with their project. So let's talk more about number 2. Open source software needs much better sustainability options. This is one that people have a lot of thoughts on, and it often comes down to things like, well, you should, and well-meaning and well-intentioned people saying things that they think would help with the sustainability, but the reality of which is don't usually. For instance, there is an idea of GitHub sponsorships, and GitHub sponsorships are turned on for Mock. And for a number of very, very, very large projects, the average per month sponsorship is $30 or less total per month. So the whole world depends on some of these packages, and they are getting paid less than $1 a day. Well, that's kind of hard because of the fact that it takes hours and hours and hours of work to maintain these projects. And as we said, these projects kind of support or hold up an entire ecosystem of paid projects and free projects that depend on them. And so we need a better option for sustainability. Just saying, hey, out of the kindness of your heart, can you give us money, doesn't bring in the type of money that you would expect it might. And in fact, I do not believe that Microsoft even supports Mock, even though they use it. So very, very, very large company, lots of money, they don't support it. There's hundreds, though, of companies that don't really support what they use. And so when it comes down to it, these companies are dependent on free labor. they're dependent on the open source software that, it was put out with good intentions to, as a passion project to put out there, and people said, hey, I think this is the way I do things, and you can share in this, you can actually use it too, because out of the goodness of my heart, I'm just kind of sharing my work. And that grows into, you have to keep going, you have to keep updating, you have to do bug fixes, you have to, but at the same time, we're not going to pay you. And that's not a great way to sustain open source. And I think that's coming to a head more and more now. We've seen a number of different projects that have made some changes. There's another organization, HashiCorp, is looking at making some changes, or has made some change to their model that will require a different way of sponsoring their project and require it. So that's going to happen more because of the fact that just relying on free labor is not sustainable. So we need some better sustainability options. And so it's not necessarily just corporate sponsorships or sponsorships in general. It's not necessarily corporate licensing, because that's expensive and hard to do. And that's where SponsorLink was trying to be a middle ground, where he was trying to go to developers and say, I'm not going to do the corporate sponsorship thing. I'm just going to go to the people who are using it. Now, you can use your corporate money to pay for that sponsorship, but he's going directly to the people using it, because that's the easiest way to track who's responsible for the usage. And his thought was, hey, if everybody gave $1 a month, that would be enough money to pay for maybe even workers to work on this. So it'd be a lot of money. And that's, kind of a middle ground, but it's not one that has a good way of maintaining that either. So there's not really a great solution out there. So open source software needs better sustainability options. Number 3, consumers of open source software really don't have a say in how open source software is run. And this kind of sounds a little harsh if you look at it one way. And if you look at it the other way, it's kind of more defeatist, as in you don't have a say. But the reality is that the person who, or the group of people who give away software for free don't really owe you anything. And so as it becomes more and more popular, it takes up more and more of their time, puts more and more pressure on them to make sure that there's no, major bugs. When every version of .NET comes out, they update it properly, and they make sure that, all the changes they're requested, they kind of, even just managing the requested changes is hard. And they're doing all that for free, or for almost free, even if they have sponsorships. Again, the average repo is getting less than $30 a month, probably. That's what I've heard a number of people, even with large repos, say. So, they're not making a whole lot of money. So why is it that as a consumer who gets all this for free and can build your application on the backs of others' work, why would you have a say in how they decide to run that open source? Now, it's also a danger, because if you then build your software on something that you don't have a say in, that could cause you future pain down the road. And that's absolutely true. And that's something to think through, is how much of a dependency do we take on open source software? And, for some people, that has been kind of not something they've thought about. And so their entire ecosystem is based upon nothing but open source. And that's kind of dangerous. And it's also kind of, not helpful at all to just put more and more pressure on someone who's doing it for free. And number 4, I think the industry has an open source problem. So open source software, it's at a bad spot right now, I think, because of the fact that all this pressure is coming into the industry on them to maintain, again, a lot of corporate projects. Now, yes, they also support, not-for-profits and free sites and all the rest. But there's an awful lot of organizations who have paid products that depend heavily on open source. And in fact, I had a brief interaction with a person who said, you know, if every open source project asked for $1 or $2 a month, that would be unsustainable. We couldn't afford that. And if you think about that for a minute, you've built your entire application off of something that you couldn't afford to pay for. And then, you're kind of up a creek. Like that's a problem. And so that's something that we need to address and have a better handle on as an industry, rather than just taking more dependencies on open source, and rather than just kind of hoping that a whole bunch of people do a whole bunch of work for us for free. I think we need to kind of rethink how we do things. So let's talk more the open source problem. So here's the issue. An individual or small team creates a popular project. And it, of course, is not popular at first. Okay. When Mock first came out, it was not popular. It was just a new thing that somebody did, or a small group of people did. And then it starts to catch on, and it becomes popular because, they solved the problem. And instead of reinventing the wheel yourself, you just built on top of the already created wheel. And I fully support that. I think that's a great thing. But what happens is it becomes more and more popular, and then thousands of companies depend on these projects. So that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky, because the next step is that the passion project from step one becomes a required job. Because if the open source maintainer leaves a security bug open, well, that's going to endanger thousands of companies and millions of users. So the pressure is to continue to fix those bugs, to continue to update to new versions, to continue to add new features that support these projects. And it becomes more and more of a job, more and more demanding, and less of just a passion project. And sponsorships aren't the solution here, because sponsorships don't really work. That's not it. Depending on the generosity of others can be a double-edged sword. There are times, and for example, with Mock, he has found now a number of people have flocked now to the project and sponsored it. They realize, oh wait, I've been using it and have not paid for it. I've seen all the good work he's done, and I can spare a little bit of money to sponsor this project. Even organizations have sponsored the project, and that's great. And for that particular project, it might be sustainable for a while. But what happens is over time, those are going to drop off. And that's the one we see. What about the hundreds or thousands of ones that aren't in the spotlight right now? Are they getting the same level of support? Well, no. They may get a little bit, but not nearly as much. And so what happens is you have the GoFundMe approach, where if my GoFundMe is popular, then I get way more than I need, and we all feel good about buying you a car and getting you your health care taken care of, whatever. But there's a whole bunch of GoFundMes that are not funded and who don't get the car or the surgery they need or the whatever they need, and that's what we have here with open source. Is we have this passion project that turned into a required job that they can't afford to keep doing. And it's something where you might say, well, they don't have to do it. Well, okay, so what happens to a popular software when the open source project says we're going to shut down now, we're just not going to do it anymore? Well, there's a whole bunch of uproar, and then there's a whole bunch of mess of people trying to change off it, and it causes a big ripple effect in the industry, and that's not good either. And it can even endanger projects or applications in the meantime. So there's not a good solution here, and again, sponsorships aren't the solution. Now, let's talk about some frequent opinions that I've heard that I want to talk more about briefly, just because I want to address them as they come up, and just talk through the both sides of it. And this is one of the things I want you to make sure you're thinking through. Is there are multiple sides to every issue, and this one specifically. What the maintainers go through is one side. What the consumers go through is another valid side. And so when you're on one side, it's easy to kind of miss the other side and what they're going through or what they are faced with. And so I want to kind of hit that balance of there's more than one side here. But let's talk about these frequent opinions. The first one, you can't ask for money now after you've used your project for years for free. And this is kind of laughable because, I put the for free in there. That's not usually what people say. Usually they say, hey, we've used your project for years. You can't now say we have to pay for it. And why not? I guess the question. Why not? What was there a contract with you that you entered in where you did something in exchange for the thing you got? Well, no, you did nothing and got something. That's not going to be a sustainable thing. And that's where I think we need to think through using open source is if you're going to build a business that's dependent on stuff you're getting for free, that may change, and it may change soon. And if it does, are you okay with that? Can you sustain that? So yes, I think that it definitely can. There is a contract is between two parties, and usually both have to give something. And you haven't given anything, and there's no payment that you've made. And even if you did sponsor, that's not the same as entering into a contract. This is why it's also difficult for people like the maintainer of Mock to get corporate licensing. Because even if he added corporate licensing instead, well, that does create a contract. That does add requirements. That does add things like service level agreements and ensuring that the security fixes are fixed in a timely manner and so many other things that come with all the strings that come with that sponsorship. So just saying, well, just do this, that's not the solution either. But changing over time is definitely within the right of the maintainer. If everyone asked for money, we couldn't afford it. Well, like I said before, if that's where you're at, then you kind of messed up. Because if the only way your business can survive is for people to do work for you for free, then you don't really have a business. What you have is a burden on people that gives you money. There's a similar argument with companies that say we can't afford to pay our workers a living wage because then he wouldn't make any money. And so what are you doing? Well, you're paying less than you really need to and making the worker, not get enough money in order to pass that on to the consumer. Well, you know what? That's not what your product costs. Your product costs what it really costs, and just taking it out and making your employees kind of bite the bullet for you or for your bottom line isn't great, and making people work for free for you also isn't something sustainable. Number 3, you should have used a commercial license to get paid. Again, this is one that sounds reasonable. It sounds like, hey, you know what? If businesses use it, then they should pay for it. But for everybody else, we should use it for free. And that can be a sustainable model, except for the fact that, again, with commercial licensing comes strings. And they can be very expensive strings, and they do lock you in and tie you down. And again, that passion project turns into a job, and that might not be what you want. Well, there has to be a middle ground here between I go broke and bankrupt and I have to be tied to this thing. There has to be a middle ground in here somewhere. And so just saying you should have used a commercial license is not the right answer for everybody. It can be for certain circumstances. And I love this one. We would have paid you if. And I kind of mixed those two words up there. We would have paid if you had done this. that's something that people say a lot. People have opinions like, if you had done this, then we would have paid. If you'd asked for corporate sponsorships, we would have done that. But the reality is that's not backed up by actual actions. That's great in theory, and people love to have theories and say things like, "I would if." It's something I saw recently on TikTok where people wanted a certain thing, it wasn't in stock, and so the creator said, "Okay, I'm going to give a list here. You sign up on this list, saying yes, I want this, and I'll order to fill that list." The problem was when they actually got the thing in stock and told the list, "Okay, now it's time to order," they said less than 2% of people on that list actually ordered. And that's something I have seen personally, where people say, "I will do this if you do this." And when you actually do it, it doesn't actually happen. Not nearly at the percentage people think it will. So this is not something that you can't make choices based upon wishes and promises, because wishes and promises don't actually pay the bills. So just saying we would have paid you if, or paid if you had done this, that's not a solution. That's a suggestion, but don't think that that's actually what would happen. All right. Number 5, I'll fork it to bypass the problem. This is another one that came out a lot. Was kind of like it was used as almost an angry retort. So when Mock in version 4.20 put out the payment nag screen, the people said, "Well, I'm going to fork 14 or 4.19 and just do that instead." And that's great. Go for it. And even the creator said the same thing. Go for it. Do it. You've always had that option. The problem is that it's not the fork that's going to solve the problem. Because yes, the fork is going to be free. It's going to not have the nag screen. It's not going to have the software. It's going to check for your email address. Cool. But what happens when there is a security flaw? What do? Are you going to make the changes to fix it? Or are you going to start maintaining the software? And that's where the rubber meets the road, is that people don't want to maintain the software. People don't want to deal with the issues that came in. And in fact, there is, one person actually created a fork and tried to really pump it up, but the issues aren't open right now. And why is that? Well, because there's going to be an awful lot of issues that come in that they're not going to want to solve. And that's going to be a lot of work that, isn't actually going to add anything of value to them. It's just going to add much more work to them. And at some point, it'll probably come sooner than the original creator of Mock. At some point, they're not going to want to do it, and they're going to stop fixing bugs. And it's going to actually worse the community because of the fact they're now dependent on software that isn't up to date, isn't bringing the new updates in, isn't making sure that there's security fixes and so on. So a fork sounds great, and for the immediate, we need to have a new version of this, that might be a solution. However, the reality is you always could have just said, we're going to stop updating Mock at 4.19. That's the equivalent of just forking it and then leaving the code alone. So just use that version of the NuGet package. Don't update past that. Your problem is solved and you don't have to do any work. So that's not the solution either. I'll just give my business to some other library. And this makes me laugh. And yes, I worded this way intentionally, but your business, what business is that? So there is no value you add to an open source library by using it. And yes, you can say, okay, the value is they get more GitHub stars, or the value is they get more downloads. How exactly does that help the open source maintainer? It doesn't. I mean, popularity may feel good and it may get them some prestige, but that's actually a negative in most cases because it brings more issues. It brings more people that want more things and more things that, that make them have to do more work. And so taking your business somewhere else, cool, go for it. That's not going to solve the open source problem, and it's not going to ensure that the next library you go to doesn't do the same thing because they encounter the same problem if everyone goes to that new library. Number 7, libraries accept pull requests shouldn't charge people. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of pull requests, how they work, and what it really means to be an open source contributor. So in open source, you can issue or give a pull request and say, okay, I've made this change to your software. All you have to do is approve it, and all my work will go into your library. And the idea, the thought is that this is a very, very helpful thing, and it can be. However, it is not always, and in fact, a lot of times it's not helpful to give a pull request. And here's why. Let's just say, and I saw this with one creator, they said that they had accepted in the early days of their library before it became very popular, they had accepted a complex pull request that added some nice new features. And they accepted it, and they brought it into their library, and now their library has these nice new features. But the person who created that pull request went away. They didn't continue to maintain those sections of the code. So who does the responsibility of maintaining those lines of code fall to? Well, the original creator. So the code base has grown and grown and grown, but yet all that responsibility falls on the original maintainer. It does not fall on the people who did the work of adding the new feature. So you might add a new feature, but you're not fixing bugs. You're not addressing security issues. You're not coming back and updating it for the new versions of .NET. And so what happens is accepting a pull request can actually be a burden on an open source library. So yes, they can be helpful because you might be able to fix a hard problem or add a new feature they've been looking for, but it can also be a burden if you don't stick around and continue to help long term. So the idea that because libraries accept pull requests, they shouldn't charge people is just laughable. It's not something that is based in the reality of understanding how this open source works. If you're on the other end doing all the work, yes, the pull requests can be helpful, but they can also, again, be draining and add more responsibility to your plate without actually adding any more value to your life. And so, no, I don't think that the accepting pull requests or not has any relationship to charging people. And then number 8, open source software should be free. And that was never the intention. Now, there is free and open source software, but even that isn't always free. But open source software, just because you can see the source code, doesn't mean you should be able to have it for free. And again, you shouldn't just expect to build off the shoulders of others without a cost. So those are my thoughts based upon these frequent opinions. Let's talk about the solution. What is the solution to this whole open source thing? The broader picture than just mock. What's the solution to kind of, the sustainability of open source? Well, number 1, I think that commercial projects paying for commercial licenses for the software they use is probably important. Now, again, we talked about just saying, well, add commercial licensing isn't an easy thing to do. It's not something that every project can do, and it comes with a lot of strings. So I don't necessarily mean that this is the with strings version of commercial licensing. It may be that we have a version that is just, we use this, so you pay for it. Does not, confer any responsibility or very little responsibility to the maintainer, but, we use a software, therefore we pay for this software. That's one way of going about it. Another, I think we need a centralized, library-friendly way to handle licensing and payments. The idea that something like a GitHub might do more than just sponsorship, but have a way to do licensing, so that we can, maybe even as part of NuGet, where NuGet would say, okay, to use these packages, here's how you pay for them once you get to a certain point. And there's a lot of different ways you can work with that. For example, Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition is free, for individuals and for open source maintainers and for even companies up to $1 million of gross income. But after that, you have to pay for it with Visual Studio 2022 Professional Edition. That can be a useful model, something like that. That's the same thing that other projects and systems do to try to allow for small projects, open source projects, community projects, and nonprofits and those kind of things to be able to use the tools and licensing and software without having a heavy burden. But at the same time, there's a sustainability there so that when you are building on top of this to build your business, that you actually pay for what you use. A way to have that centralized and an easy way for a maintainer to say, yes, I'm going to do this. And then, it be very easy to implement rather than having to create their own system or implement a bunch of licensing servers and engage a lawyer and all the rest. A way to essentially do it would be a great way to kind of improve this, or maybe even look at what Mock did and try to implement something like that in a more practical manner, in a way that was more acceptable as far as not violating GDPR, making sure it doesn't break the build process and so on, but at the same time still would allow you to put the company on the hook for paying a little bit even for using that software. And number 3, and I can't stress this enough, the solution is also civility and empathy from all and for all. This is something that has been saddening to see, is the amount of hate, the amount of anger, and even the amount of misplaced hate and anger that has come out of that situation. People fighting for things that really don't make sense because they kind of missed the point or not listened, and not listening when something else happens. So I do want to commend the creator of Mock. Daniel did a great job. I'm sorry, the maintainer of Mock, but Daniel did a great job of taking all the hits, taking all the negativity, taking all the really harsh things that were said to him, and not just returning fire. He actually listened. He made changes almost immediately. He responded to a lot of different things, and he is frustrated, I'm sure, at the anger that came out of it. That really, there wasn't that same passion towards help. It was just a passion towards tearing down. And so that's something I want to encourage in all forms. One of the things that people often don't see is the fact that anything that you get for free takes an enormous effort. On this YouTube channel, for instance, I give at least 2 videos a week. I try very hard to create high quality content, and that takes an awful lot of my time and my team's time. And that's something that, I've had to figure out, how do I monetize this in a way that makes sense and in a way that doesn't hurt the individual who cannot pay for it. And I've come up with a way of doing that where I gave away all the YouTube content for free, plus a lot more. If you go to imtimcorey.com, go to the resources section, you can see even more stuff for free. But I've given away whole courses for free, and I've done a bunch of different things using some creative means. For example, usually when I do some type of sponsorship, I use that sponsorship money to pay for something more for you. For instance, MongoDB sponsored me, and I gave away an entire course on YouTube because, you know what? They paid for the course to be given away for free. And so that's what I do. I also have courses that I sell, and I do not sell them for the cheapest possible rate. I sell them for a value that can sustain and grow my business and grow my ability to give away more free content. And that's the way I monetize things. But I often get pushback from people who are saying things like, that's too expensive. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't charge for that. And you know what? Why? When I look at it, I say, I'm doing work for you for free. What, What more do you want? And so that's something that I think that, if we think about it from the other person's perspective, how many people who are complaining are also doing 20, 30, 40 hours a week of giving away their time to somebody else for free? Not many. And so that's where if you were empathetic towards that and say, hey, I wouldn't want to do that. And just saying, I appreciate you doing that can make a world of difference to people, because often what these open source maintainers hear is not, I appreciate that. It is, there's a bug in your code. Fix this. This needs to be fixed right away. You need to do this. You need to do that. You shouldn't do this. It'd be great to have them hear more from people who are saying, I appreciate what you do. You know what? My company depends on what you do, and so we're going to sponsor you. You know what? My open source project depends on you. I can't afford to pay you, but I want to say thank you because you make what I do possible. That can go a long way. Understanding, being civil to each other, even if you disagree. And, the way SponsorLink was implemented, wasn't great. It should have been an alpha build. It should have been a beta build. It should not have been in production right away. A number of different things could have been done differently. But just because I disagree with how it's implemented does not give me the right to be angry and flap the handle. Instead, I can be civil and have a civil conversation and say, you know what? I would appreciate it if you would this next time do this. And you know what? It's not my library. I can't control it, but I can have a civil conversation. And, Daniel did change even off those civil conversations. Daniel did make changes, and that's great. And then having empathy to really look at the other person's perspective and say, you know what? I can see why it's frustrating. I can see why it's draining. I can see why I wouldn't want to come home from a full day's worth of work and then work for free for the entire internet, seemingly, who doesn't seem like they're at all grateful and definitely isn't putting their money where their mouth is. I can understand that. And so, I can understand why you might try something like SponsorLink to kind of push them to show their, at least kind of pay a little bit for their usage and getting hit at for that. I can understand why it's frustrating, and I don't want to be a part of that. So those are the things I think that are the solution. There's not a one overall, this solves everything solution, at least not yet. But I think these things would be helpful for making the open source community more healthy in what it does. Okay, so number one for the conclusions here, you can still use Mock if you want. It's up to you. You don't have to. And if you decide you want to move off of Mock, that's fine. If you want to fork Mock, that's fine. Just, understand the implications of whatever you're doing, because just making a knee-jerk reaction is not wise. And you know what? If you need some time to think about it, just don't upgrade past 4.19, or even, the current version of Mock does not have SponsorLink in it. So you can still upgrade to the latest version on NuGet. But maybe pause it right there and take all the time you need to think through, do I want to stay on this or do I want to move? It's up to you. I would still use Mock, but it's up to you. Number two, these situations are going to continue to happen. And again, we saw this with HashiCorp and the way they changed their licensing going forward to require payment and to not allow it in certain circumstances and so on. That's going to happen because open source is not long-term sustainable the way we've been doing it. And so things are going to change. Either libraries are going to go away, or they're going to have to start charging, or something else is going to have to happen. Maybe corporations lend developers to help maintain and continue to push forward. That might be a solution, although it can also be a double-edged sword. But again, if they put in software or put in code that is, maybe even beyond what the original maintainer can maintain, and they leave, well, that actually can kill the project. So there's a lot of different things to think through, but these types of situations are going to continue to happen. Number three, sponsor the libraries you use. It doesn't matter if they have a licensing scheme or not, if they whatever. Just be kind. Talk to your company and say, hey, I want $1,000 a year, and I want to divide it over these 20 libraries. So $50 a month for each of these libraries, $1,000 a month or a year. That's not a big deal. Like that's something a company can do, and my math might be off there. But anyways, that's not a big deal, and a company can definitely do that. And it's something where you could turn around and make sure that those libraries see that they're valued. And it could even be you could push it as you'll get your name on the front page of the README to your company, and that can be even just a way to say, hey, here's what we do and here's who we are, and kind of get your name out in the community. So sponsor the libraries you use. Number 4, be kind to others. I guess I'm going to leave you on this because I think that's the overall. If you want to make the world a better place, especially on the internet, be kind to others. Just be kind. And even if you disagree, even if you think they do the wrong thing, even if you don't like how they do things, be kind to others. It's going to take you a long way. It's going to make you a better person and make the situation better as well. So that's my thoughts on the mock situation and open source in general. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But again, leaning towards number 4, we're going to have a civil conversation about this. You start going off the rails there, I'll start kicking you out because you know what? I can't. Okay. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.